before elections. If everything that people said they would do had been done, well, we wouldn't even be here. Everything would be solved. So that's not really an argument. I was listening to Senator Eagleton earlier compare C-45 to the Prohibition Act. Not quite the same thing. Really not. Prohibition did not involve children of 10, 12, 15 years of age. It was about adult alcohol use. I'm a father and a grandfather, and so is Senator Harder. I'm not sure whether in 10, 12, 15 years, if he sees his granddaughter turn up with a joint in the living room, well, he just may say, where did you get that? Who gave you that? And, well, the granddaughter may well say, well, it was the government. My little cousin, yeah, but it was the government. My time is out. Very well. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Fellow Senators, I would like to speak on third reading to Bill C-45. Over 2 years ago, the Trudeau government announced they were beginning the process of legalizing the recreational use of marijuana. Since this was a part of their election platform, along with 226 other policies, including balancing the budget by 2019, they maintained that there was no need to consult with Canadians on whether legalization was the right path to take. And so, then Justin Trudeau's government launched a task force stacked with members who had vested interests in legalized marijuana and asked them for advice on how to proceed. Advice the task force was only too happy to provide for them. It's telling that at no time did the Trudeau government take a science-based approach to determine if this was good for Canadians. Their decision appears to have been based solely on ideology and political opportunism, with little regard for its impact on the social fabric of our nation. But many others have voiced their concerns. Over the last 2 years, the government has been repeatedly admonished for its recklessness and irresponsible approach to marijuana legalization. And yet, despite the chorus of voices warning the Trudeau government, it has steadfastly refused to listen. There is simply not enough time for me to even try to summarize all the concerns. I know my caucus colleagues have spoken mightily against the Trudeau government's approach to marijuana legislation. And also, in the words of witnesses from the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health, I quote, legalization will be a major and unprecedented social and health policy experiment. And I can't believe that this chamber of sober second thought is choosing to ignore the numerous warnings about many harms that will follow legalization. Instead, we just seem to be marching on ahead in a fog of self-induced opportunism with no solid evidence to support this unscientific decision. And we have heard repeatedly that we are not ready. Police organizations across the country began warning us a year ago that they would need more time to prepare. Healthcare professionals such as Dr. Sharon Levy, and she appeared before the Science, Technology and Social Committee. She's the medical director of the Adolescent Substance Abuse Program at Boston Children's Hospital and Associate Professor of Pediatrics at Harvard Medical School, warned that healthcare infrastructure in Canada is not adequately prepared to provide appropriate treatment for teens with cannabis use disorders. And this problem stands to become much worse after legal sales of cannabis begins. She also stated that I have treated a number of teen cannabis users who developed schizophrenia right in front of my eyes. And she described about how the only way to adequately be able to console these young people was to put her arms around them and just hug them as tightly as she could until they finally started or stopped with the tremors and began to come out of this cannabis-induced psychotic disorder. She also warned that Canada has one medical specialist with her qualifications. So how on earth are we going to cope with the chaos, the medical chaos, emergency room visits that will escalate once this dangerous drug is seemingly approved? Mental health professionals have warned that the age of possession is too low. And some of my colleagues have spoken extensively about the effects on the brain. And my second reading speech was about anandamide, a normal brain substance, being similar in size and chemical shape as THC, allowing THC to trick the brain into thinking that this was a normally produced chemical. And the list is extensive. Of course, children and young people under the age of 25 whose brains are still developing, parents and families, social and religious groups, premiers, mayors, municipalities, law professors and associations, employers, condo and apartment organizations, and the list just goes on. I, for the life of me, cannot understand how on earth any government in any country could proceed with legislation that is so thoroughly being called out by every possible affected group. And even Indigenous groups have repeatedly said they were not consulted and they needed more time and were not ready. So I could go on and on with this "we are not ready" mantra, but it is a fact. It is beyond belief that the Trudeau government would choose to trample on the concerns of the majority of people across Canada rather than to take the time to study these concerns. I fail to understand why the government is in such a hurry and why this chamber appears ready to give its blessings to this trampling. The bill before us, sadly and dramatically, will change the fabric of our nation. And I do believe, or I do not believe, I should say, that history will speak kindly of the political masters and sycophants who are enabling this legislation, this dangerous drug, allowing it to become legalized. And history will surely condemn people in this place who support this legislation, who simply know better. This legislation, the cost of which will be borne disproportionately by our precious young people, whose lives will be broken, whose dreams will be shattered and disintegrate, and whose families will live with loss. And not every young person will experience these things, but too many will, and one is too many. So today, I will not vote for this Trudeau government agenda. I will not vote for C-45, Bill C-45, and I'm asking all the senators opposite to do the right thing and just say no to legalizing this dangerous drug. Thank you. Senator Mockler on debate.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.
I heard her earlier, and I do agree with Senator Lankin on some subject matters, and I quote her. I believe that complex public policy will always have problems during implementation, and such a complex public policy as C-45, with so much for us still to learn, will for sure have problems. We should expect that and use the opportunity to learn from the challenges we encounter. Developmental evaluation, end of the quote. Chers sénateurs, je me dois...
Honorable Senators, I must tell you that I remain very sensitive to and even touched and affected deeply in my heart when I rise to speak in this debate, which will influence the lives of our children and change a public policy that may wind up having a dramatic effect on Canadians' lives.
Single mother, born on welfare, and yes, I will share with you, I have seen the effects of substance abuse and the consequences, and there is no doubt others have some similar experiences. Also, with my approximate 34 years as a parliamentarian coming from the Legislative Assembly of New Brunswick to the Senate of Canada, this bill, C-45 cannabis, is going to change the quality of life of all Canadians. It is not good enough to justify passing such a bill, and we hear because it will create jobs, because it will bring more taxes, because we have a majority, a government mandate. We promised it. Senators, it is said, only fools do not change their minds. Another justification, we must take it from the hands of criminals. Honorable Senators, I have made a lot of round tables. I've had the opportunity to meet many New Brunswickers in the last 6 months, and they tell me we need more information. Why is the government, they said, fast-tracking such a policy decision that will impact on us? There is no doubt in my mind, this chamber, sober second thought, however, we have given it due diligence and we have given it our best in this debate. Will we have a showdown with the government in the other house by ignoring our amendments? If so, I see Canadians will not accept that venue. Nevertheless, the day will come one day, Canadians will decide this matter, and God, thank you, we call it democracy, the next election. Senators, I agree with my colleague also from New Brunswick, Senator Lovelace Nicholas, that just said, having concerns and being skeptical to the letter that First Nations have received yesterday. Chers amis, as Winston Churchill once said, it is better to be both right and consistent, but if you have to choose, you must choose to be right. Honorable Sénateur, j'estime qu'avant de voter sur cette...
Honorable Senators, I feel that before we vote on this important bill, it is our duty and our responsibility as the Sober Second Thought Chamber to do our best to see whether this bill should exist, whether the aims are reasonable and can be reached, and whether, all said and done, this will have a positive effect on the well-being, health, and quality of life of all Canadians. As many of my colleagues have risen to say before me, it was essential that we take whatever time was necessary to think through its scope and to understand the impact that this potential new law will have on our Canadian society, wherever we may live in Canada, and to inform the Canadians, all Canadians, about the impact of cannabis on their health, and especially on the health of their children and all our grandchildren.
Concern over this legislation. First, since we represent the same province in this House, I would like to say that I share the concerns expressed by Senator Poirier, McIntyre, and Stuart Olson. Honorable sénateur, le sénateur McIntyre a certainement vu de très près.
Honorable Senator, Senator McIntyre has worked extensively in the law of Canada and has a good idea of what effect the cannabis use may have on our youth. Senator Stuart Olson.
The legislation and the lack of preparedness in our province on both the provincial government and the various police forces that will be responsible to implement such a policy. Honorable
Senators, I also share the concerns and proposals for improvements to the bill that I've heard from Honorable Senators Smith, Galvez, Boisvenu, Dagenet, and Carignan, as well as by Senators O and White.
Mind ourselves and let us think about it. Une étude comme celle du groupe SAM aux États-Unis.
A study such as that of the SAM group in the States, which was entitled Lessons Learned from Marijuana Legislation in 4 U.S. states and D.C.,
well known across the world, made up of prominent medical and academic experts from respected institutions such as Harvard Medical School, Boston Children's Hospital, have looked at the impact on health, safety, crime, and the workforce in 4 states that have since 2012 legalized recreational marijuana use, namely the states of Colorado, Washington, Alaska, Oregon, and the District of Columbia. Their findings, honorable senators, were reviewed by prominent scientists and researchers who concluded that the SAM report serves, and I quote, as an evidence-based guide to what we currently observe in various states. Honorable senators, let me summarize their findings by quoting directly from their report. And I say, and it is said, today's highly potent marijuana represents a growing and significant threat to public health safety, a threat that is amplified by a new marijuana industry intent on profiting from heavy use. State laws allowing marijuana have, in direct contradiction to federal law, permitted this industry to flourish, influencing both policies and policymakers alike. While the consequences of these policies will not be known for decades, early indicators are troubling. And end of the quote. I have no doubt in my mind that the government did not pay attention to these scientific findings and the many others, despite their election promise that they would listen to scientists and act accordingly. Honorable sénateur, lorsque j'ajoute
Honorable senators, when I pair my own concerns to those of my colleagues and those of many health experts, of education experts, those of representatives of municipalities and police officers, groups that will be affected by the legislation, then I can say, honorable senators, that the effect of cannabis use on the health of our adolescents will be of great concern. According to psychiatrist Didier Dutras-Aswad of the University of Montreal, who reviewed 120 scientific studies on this matter, the risk of developing a psychosis or even schizophrenia is multiplied by 4 or 5 for any adolescent using cannabis regularly. As it has been shown that the human brain continues to develop up until the age of 25 years, many health organizations across our land, including the Canadian Pediatric Society, the Canadian Medical Association, the Medical Society of New Brunswick, wished to ensure that the eventual law not allow for recreational use before the age of 25 years of age, and that no use be made before the age of 21, but we've seen that that is not held.
The comments made by various police forces, such as the Fredericton Police and the Ontario Provincial Police, that police officers will be ill-equipped and not sufficiently trained to ensure public safety in our municipalities and highways if the cannabis legislation is approved this summer. Honourable Senators, the legalization of marijuana will present new challenges for employers, including the possibility of injuries caused by impairment. Honourable Senators, the federal and provincial governments don't invest substantially in prevention and education programs. We will not be providing young Canadians with the information they need now to make such important decision for their physical and mental health. Honourable
Senators, I believe, just as the Canadian Association of Police Chiefs and organizations representing municipalities such as the Association of French-speaking Municipalities of New Brunswick, the Union of Municipalities of Quebec as well, that local governments will be called upon to ensure that the new legislation be respected on the ground and that citizens be protected from organized crime. They need the Canadian government's help and support. This is a necessity.
My last concern is that Bill C-45 will allow the sale of cannabis on First Nations, where substance abuse, we know, is already known to be a serious problem, often leading to the premature death of young Canadians. Certainly, the sale and distribution of cannabis should not be allowed on these First Nations until the community leadership has been able to bring these serious abuse problems under control. We should not fall prey to promises. I am very concerned on the fact that the First Nations have not been consulted. Some of the proposed legislation is even contrary to their right to self-government. Let us never forget the promises that have been made to First Nations in the past. Let us remind ourselves challenges in their communities such as mental health, addiction services, drinking water, and housing. And I've been here 10 years and we still have those challenges. Honourable Senators, it becomes more and more evident that the government has hurried this legislation and did not do its homework properly. They are not right on this issue now. We need time. They certainly did not take into consideration the many concerns raised by some 150 Canadian experts who appeared and testified before the 5 Senate committees. It is also evident that the legislation is passed this session. The government will not have all the regulation in place this summer. Therefore, Canadians will start growing their own cannabis plants without proper regulations. Why not take the time to better inform Canadians about the real impact of cannabis on our health, on their health? I believe that by rushing this legislation through, the government is missing a good opportunity, like Winston Churchill said, to get it right. Why not put this legislation on hold until January 1st, 2019 and proceed right away with a national information campaign on the dangers of cannabis on health and public and safety of our people? As Winston Churchill said, and I quote him again, "It is better to be both right and consistent, but if you have to choose, you must choose to be right." To the Government of Canada, let's take the time to get this legislation right. Merci beaucoup, chers sénateurs.
Thank you, dear Senators.
Senator Wu on debate.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.
It's the hour at which we are expected to make the final vote on C-45. I understand that there will be a gaggle of reporters in the foyer looking for comment on what we did and how we decided. As I thought about what I might say to the media, I decided to turn my reflections into a short speech in part also because what I say to the media will also be what I have to say to my family, to my friends, to my community, my constituents, when I go back to British Columbia. As many of you will go back to your provinces and hometowns this weekend, I imagine much of the chatter around the kitchen tables and in church halls or wherever you might hang out, there will be questions on what happened that Thursday in the Senate when we were asked to vote on such a consequential bill. And this, colleagues, is what I will say. Let me first of all express that I hope the bill does pass. And based on that assumption, I will have a few messages to share. The first is that the Senate did its job. We have already heard about the extensive review throughout the normal process of this chamber, augmented by a special process whereby 5 committees reviewed this bill in its various components and spent more than 215 hours studying those various elements. There were countless other meetings that took place outside of the formal structure, meetings organized by the sponsor, meetings organized by interested senators. I remember Senator O organizing a meeting of the Canadian Association of Pediatric Specialists, and others who have organized meetings with community leaders, with academic researchers, with medical specialists, with police officers, and so on and so forth. And the hard work that has gone into the review of this bill for over 8 months is evidenced in the nearly 50 amendments that we now see before us. Now, some of you have interpreted the numerous amendments as a sign of failure, as a sign that the bill was not right in the first place, that it is an excuse and a reason to, in fact, jettison the bill. I see it quite differently. The fact that we have about 29 amendments that are so-called technical improvements to the bill is testimony to the fact that this upper house did its job in carefully studying the legislation, finding ways to improve it, even small ways, and being able to persuade the government to accept that. What better testimony to the role of the Chamber of Sober Second Thought? The Senate has also done its job because of the way in which we organize our debate in these last few days, but throughout also the committee review process. I want to remind colleagues that the idea of a structured debate was put forward by none other than our sponsor at the very beginning of the process. And I wrote to all leaders back in November 2017 asking for precisely this kind of structured process where we could go through the thematic areas of the bill and have a debate that was cohesive and contiguous. That's in fact what we've had the last few days, and as Senator Omidvar has recommended, I hope we will consider it for debates on other bills. I commend my fellow leaders for their foresight and wisdom in agreeing to the timeline that we had, working collaboratively. That again, I think, is evidence of a Senate that is working, a new Senate that is working. And once again, I hope this kind of cooperation can continue for future bills. From the perspective of the Independent Senators Group, I'm so proud of my colleagues who have demonstrated their willingness, ability, and their capacity to collaborate in a way that I've not seen before, while maintaining their independence. And that's, I think, in part why we've had so many meaningful amendments to the bill. Having said that, my colleagues supported a number of amendments that came from the Conservatives, and I'm very proud of them for doing so as well. And it's a demonstration, once again, of the independence of our group. No question that we have seen extraordinary work from our sponsor of the bill. We've seen extraordinary work from the chairs of the 5 committees that led the review of the different aspects of the bill. But as others have already said, I need to give a special shout out to the chair and the two deputy chairs of Social Affairs, Senators Eggleton, Seidman, and Petitclerc. They helped us through the most difficult part of the process and took us to the other side intact and in good shape. My first message then, to my community, my friends, my colleagues, my constituents, to the media, is that this Senate has shown it is working. The new Senate is functioning well, and we should hold our heads up high. My second message, colleagues, is that there are known harms from the consumption of marijuana, but legalization will do nothing to reduce those intrinsic harms of the drug. Let me say that differently. Legalization does not and will not create those harms. Those harms already afflict many Canadians, and not legalizing cannabis will perpetuate the already dire public health situation that we face because of the ubiquitous availability of illicit cannabis. My third message is as follows. The best way to reduce those harms of cannabis consumption is, in fact, to legalize and regulate that market. You've already heard the many arguments for legalization and against the criminalization of possession of marijuana, simple possession. We know what these harms are: stigmatization, exclusion, the disproportionate impact on indigenous people and minorities, and so on and so forth. But I want to go a little bit further to say that the logic of legalizing the cannabis industry means that we have to give that industry the best chance of succeeding. I'm not sure we've fully understood that part of the equation, and I encourage senators to think a little bit more deeply about what that means as we monitor the industry with great diligence and make sure that legalization does in fact succeed, and we not put in place regulations or restrictions on the industry that are overly severe. My fourth message is for parents and youth. The message to parents is simple. Legalization is an opportunity to have conversations with your children about the use of marijuana and the special risks that are associated with use by youth in their teens and in their early 20s. Colleagues, these conversations are not being had currently, in part because of the illegal status of cannabis. I speak from personal experience, and I truly hope that legalization will make it easier, will unlock the voices of parents everywhere to have those tough conversations, precisely because it will no longer be possible to avoid those conversations. And if any of them are listening to our debate this evening, let it be crystal clear to them. We want them to have these conversations precisely because legalization is coming, and they need to have them very soon. I also have a message for youth. My message for youth is that I will tell them the single biggest issue that we fought over in this chamber, that we debated with passion and vigor, is the impact on youth. We all know that. My second reading speech, some of you may remember, was on the age of access. I questioned whether 18 or 19 was the right age of access, given the evidence, some evidence, disputed, but some evidence that young brains develop to the age of 23, 24, 25, and that there are special risks posed by people in that age group taking cannabis. Now, I have since thought more deeply about this issue and come to accept that the age of maturity is the most practical and enforceable way of going ahead with the question of age of access. But I think we should still convey to young people that while cannabis will be legal for those who are age 18 or 19, depending on the province, they should approach the fact of cannabis as a legal product in the same way that they might think about binge drinking as a legal activity. I am in favor of the age of majority as the age of access, as I said, for a variety of reasons. But I am also inclined to believe in the evidence of a number of medical experts, we've heard them again tonight, who feel that there could be serious mental health consequences for youth up to age 25 who consume marijuana. We should repeat this message, even if the research is somewhat in dispute. We should repeat the message because we need to protect our youth as much as possible. And as the research improves, we'll provide them with new and better information. But there should be no confusing our youth that we do not want to encourage them to start marijuana, certainly not in their teen years, and possibly not even in their early 20s. Finally, colleagues, my message to all those who are out there interested in this debate is that our work is not done. C45 is only the beginning. It is not, however, as some of my conservative colleagues might say, it is not the beginning of the end. The world will not come to an end. The sky will not fall. Likewise, C45 is not the beginning of the beginning. It's not the beginning of the beginning because cannabis already exists. There already is an illicit market, a thriving illicit market. And what we're doing is to try to correct a problem that's been with us for a long time. This is not terra nova, ladies and gentlemen and colleagues. This is a situation where we have a contaminated land that we need to clean up through a judicious program of legalization, regulation, and public education. If it's not the beginning of the end, if it's not the beginning of the beginning, I would say it is in fact the gradual end of the beginning. The gradual end, I hope and pray, of a rampant illicit market that allows for a transition to the legal production, distribution, and consumption of cannabis. The end of the beginning opens the way for a new approach to cannabis that focuses on public health, harm reduction, strict regulation of legal production and distribution, and the reduction of illicit cannabis. I hope, I know, all of us will watch very closely the rollout of cannabis legislation and regulation, and we will not be afraid to put forward adjustments to the legislation and other kinds of course correction as we identify problems in the years ahead. Now, given our comparative advantage over the House of Commons, because of our institutional memory and longevity, the Senate is well placed to monitor the progress and setbacks of cannabis legalization. But make no mistake, if we legalize the cannabis market, we should do everything we can to make it succeed. When the debate has come to an end, and if in fact C45 is passed, let us all join together to make sure that its implementation succeeds. Thank you.
Senator Martin.
Honourable Senators, I rise today on this final day of the third reading debate on C45. I wish to acknowledge, along with my other colleagues, all those who made such great efforts in sponsoring, critiquing, analyzing, studying this bill to the greatest of extent that we can all stand proudly today and applaud their efforts. I'm also very proud of our chamber and have always been proud of the good work that our upper chamber does on every piece of legislation and the studies that are brought before committees. I awoke this morning, as you did, to news of what a historic day today will be. It's D-Day for Ontarians, potential D-Day for the Stanley Cup champions, if that were to be, and the day for us to arrive at the third reading vote. I also woke with many thoughts and emotions running through me and opened up my messenger with many belated messages I had not had a chance to check in the busyness of our schedule, and saw some beautiful photos of my nieces and nephews and children of my former students whom I had recently seen. So although I have spoken and intervened on various speeches, today I stand on behalf of teachers and administrators across our who are genuinely worried about what will happen should C-45 receive royal assent and marijuana be legalized, especially in provinces where the legal age could be set at 18. Schools have clear cause for concern, as 18-year-olds will be in the same schools with younger students as young as 12 years of age. I also rise on behalf of parents and grandparents who worry about what to say to their children and grandchildren about a drug that has been illegal to date in my lifetime. What can they say after legalization when the law will no longer be something that they can use to deter their children and grandchildren from developing a habit that may be very difficult to shake? Since the 2015 election and the promise of legalization of this drug, there are areas in my hometown, Vancouver, where marijuana stores are within steps and will continue to be within steps of schools, daycares, playgrounds, community centers, and people's own backyards. Over the course of the debate, senators on all sides quoted expert witnesses and competing research findings about the effects of marijuana use on youth, their brain development, and mental health. And last night, I received a link to an article published in Global News on June 6th titled, "Canadian Students Who Use Marijuana End Up with Poor Health Grades" by Graham Benjamin. I wish to read this timely article into the record. Students who try marijuana at early age and use it often are more likely to have co-occurring problems, poor health outcomes, and less occupational and educational success in young adulthood. A St. Francis Xavier University and University of Victoria study has found. The study, conducted by St. Francis Xavier psychology professor Dr. Kara Thompson and Dr. Bonnie Leadbeater of the University of Victoria, followed a cohort of 662 young people over 10 years. Researchers interviewed the youth, who were between the ages of 12 and 18 when the study began in 2003, every 2 years about their substance use, mental health, accomplishments, and general well-being. The researchers observed how substance use patterns unfolded over time, and how the patterns were influenced by other factors in adolescence and young adulthood. We hear a lot about risks for youth using cannabis, especially with legalization around the corner, but our understanding of patterns of cannabis use among young Canadian youth over time and the consequences of use is actually quite limited, said Dr. Leadbeater in a statement. Our hope is that this work sheds light on how young Canadians use cannabis across adolescence and young adulthood, what predicts different patterns of use, and how these patterns contribute to mental health and well-being of young people. The two studies found 5 different patterns of cannabis use. Approximately 30% of the youth were classified as high risk, meaning they started using cannabis frequently in early adolescence or increased in use across adolescence and were using more than once a week by young adulthood. These risky patterns of use were associated with the poorest health outcomes in young adulthood, including higher levels of substance use disorders, mental health, and behavior problems, as well as lower levels of educational and employment outcomes, the study found. Dr. Thompson and the young people who followed high-risk patterns used both cannabis and other substances during adolescence. They were also experiencing other behavioral problems. An effective public health approach to reducing cannabis for youth will need to acknowledge the context and co-occurring problems that accompany risky cannabis use in young people. Dr. Thompson said in a statement, "The findings from the study are hoped to provide government and other public health practitioners a source to inform current and future cannabis policies." I shared this article with you, colleagues, with the hope that in this 11th hour, after all is said and done, that each one of us will think about the fork in the road that awaits us. Senator Petitclerc talked about the finish line. And yes, it is today's finish line, but we know there are other steps that will follow, and that is for future debate. So, Senator Petitclerc, I can share in your vision to make Canada, and I think we all do, to make Canada the best in the world in which youth are empowered to reach their highest potential. But I guess what I do not share is your confidence that Bill C-45 is potentially the path to achieving this. In my vision for Canada, it is not to become the best through the legalization of an illicit drug in every other federal jurisdiction in the world other than Uruguay, but through saying perhaps no to C-45, and I agree that we should decriminalize, and we should look at that very seriously. And perhaps legalization, but when it's a better time. Because right now, with the body of evidence and the growing concerns and the growing number of calls and emails that we're all receiving, I just feel as though this is not the time, and that the risks of legalization, no matter the financial benefits, is too high. So, honorable senators, two roads will diverge. And I'm just afraid that depending on the path we follow, way will lead to way, and we will never be able to know what could have happened. So I know that all of us, take this upcoming vote very, very seriously. Today does feel like a historic day for me, I'm sure for all of us, and I do hope that all of us will choose wisely. Thank you.
Senator Mercer.
Honourable Senators, change takes time. It also takes a little getting used to once it has actually been accomplished. If you look back over past generations, you see such things as women winning the right to vote, and most recently, the right for same-sex couples to marry. Today, we cannot fathom now how these rights would even be in question. But social change does not come easy and takes time, sometimes several generations. In the end, change happens, even if we don't want it to, for better or for worse. The debate over drugs seems never-ending, and I guess it should be. All debate should be never-ending. New ideas, new science, new generations of citizens will come forward with what they believe is a better way for society to live. When we speak about this current piece of legislation, Bill C-45, we hear both sides of the argument for and against. We need more time to study it. We should have done it years ago. It will affect people in ways we don't know. Do we try this and see how it goes? These are natural questions, of course, but at some point, a decision has to be made. I would remind honourable senators that debate over legalization of marijuana has been going on for decades. An early Senate report on cannabis, the 1955 report of the Senate Special Committee on the Traffic of Narcotic Drugs advocated for the continued prohibition of illicit drugs. Then, in 1972, we had cannabis, the report of the Canadian Government Commission on the Inquiry into the Non-Medical Use of Drugs, aka the Ledane Commission report, which included the repeal of the prohibition against the simple possession of cannabis and cultivation for personal use. That was 1972, colleagues. In 1994, Bill C-7, an act respecting the control of certain drugs, their prescriptions, and other substances, and to amend certain other acts and repeal the Narcotic Control Act in consequence thereof, was introduced in the other place. The bill died and was reintroduced as Bill C-8 in 1996 and was examined by the Senate. So now we're in 1996, colleagues. According to the Canadian Foundation for Drug Policy, several members of the Standing Committee on Legal and Constitutional Affairs publicly stated their support for decriminalization of marijuana, but dropped the idea of recommending that there be no criminal charge for having a few joints of marijuana because they felt that it would never pass the House of Commons. They went on to indicate that, as Senator Carstairs said, the panel members were indeed serious about decriminalization, but foresaw that a recommendation would be futile at this point. She said, the majority of senators, and I was one of them, she said, felt all of the evidence indicated decriminalization for simple possession is the way we should be going, she said in an interview. The report on C-8 did recommend, though, that the Standing Committee on Legal and Constitutional Affairs strongly urges that a joint Senate and House of Commons committee be struck to review all of Canada's existing drug laws and policies and programs. On June the 2nd, 1999, the late Honourable Pierre-Claude Nolan, our former colleague, moved that a special committee of the Senate be appointed to reassess Canada's anti-drug legislation and policies, to carry out a broad consultation of the Canadian public to determine the specific needs of various regions of the country where social problems associated with the trafficking and use of illegal drugs is more in evidence, to develop proposals to disseminate information about Canada's anti-drug policy, and finally to make recommendations for an anti-drug strategy developed by and for Canadians under which all levels of government to work closely together to reduce the harm associated with the use of illegal drugs. The committee did a great amount of work and released its report in September 2002, which I'm sure you've all read, or at least I hope you have. That's 2002, colleagues. It does touch on many issues most senators have raised in debate on Bill C-45 before us today. The report states, in effect, the main social costs of cannabis are a result of public policy choices, primarily its continued criminalization, while the consequences of its use represents a small fraction of the social cost attributable to the use of illegal drugs. It goes on to say, our former colleague goes on to say in this report, in our view, it is clear that if the aim of public policy is to diminish consumption and supply of drugs, specifically cannabis, all signs indicate complete failure. That was the existing situation, according to our he continues, in our opinion, the committee's opinion, the data we have collected on cannabis and its derivatives provides sufficient grounds for our general conclusion that the regulation of the production and distribution and consumption of cannabis, inasmuch as it is part of an integrated and adaptable public policy, is best able to respond to the principles of autonomy governance that fosters human responsibility and a limitation of penal law to the situations where there is demonstrable harm to others. A regulatory system for cannabis should permit, the report continues on, specifically, more effective targeting of illegal traffic and a reduction in the role played by organized crime. Prevention programs better adapted to the real world, better able to prevent and detect an at-risk behavior, enhance and monitoring of products, quality and properties, better user information and education, and respect for individual and collective freedoms, and legislation more in tune with the behavior of Canadians. Our friend Pierre-Claude Nolan. The committee's report says, in our opinion, Canadian society is ready for a responsible policy of cannabis regulation that complies with these basic principles. So, honourable colleagues, in my examples here, from 1955 to 2002, look at the changes in opinions and notice how long it took for said opinions to change. Now think about what we are doing here. It is 2018, 16 years after the Nolan report recommended pretty much what C-45 is doing. Are we ready for this? I think we were then, and I think we are now. We can always question whether it is time for such legislation, its validity, and its safety. What we should not question is the fact that it is time to try something different in the war on drugs. Only then will we see if it has worked, which I'm confident it will. While I may not be happy with some of the amendments we have agreed to here in the Senate, for better or for worse, I am happy to support this legislation, and I encourage all of you to do so as well.
Very happy. I don't want to take everybody's time and have another speech repeating what has been said, but do you think Senator Nolan would have voted for this legislation?
I think he would have wanted to sponsor this legislation.
Question?
Est-ce que vous avez bien lu le rapport Nolan qui dit...
You have read the Nolan report, which said that the brain was completely developed at 16.
Mercer?
Each report says something different, and we've evolved as we've gone along. Yes, you've read the report, you know what it says.
Senator McIntyre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Honourable Senators, I rise today to speak briefly on third reading to Bill C-45. As you know, I already spoke on second reading of this bill February 13th. At that time, my speech focused on two issues. First, with respect to seeking legal advice on tobacco versus marijuana-related health effects and healthcare costs. And second, with respect to Canada's international treaty obligations relating to marijuana. The two issues were posted as written question on the Senate's notice paper. Colleagues, as we all know, several professional associations and doctors have produced papers or submitted press releases to inform the government on the maximum effort needed to limit the health risks generated by Bill C-45. Those experts have also appeared before our various Senate committees expressing concerns about the impacts of the legalization of cannabis on young adults, in particular among those who are most vulnerable. Given that significant risks concern mental health, more specifically for young people, I also join my voice on the dangers of the proposed legalization of cannabis. Let me share my experience with you. For close to 40 years, I headed a law office in northern New Brunswick, specializing in both criminal and civil law. During that period of time, I also had the privilege to act as chairperson of the New Brunswick Criminal Code Review Board, which derives its authority under Section 672.38 of the Code. The board deals with individuals suffering from a mental disorder who commit a criminal act, following which they are found either unfit to stand trial or, if fit, not criminally responsible on account of mental disorder by the court. Those individuals are either released into the community or remanded in a psychiatric hospital pending a disposition hearing by the review board. A large majority of the cases that I heard as chairperson of the review board were related to the usage of illicit drugs, particularly cannabis. Now, that said, obviously, the individuals falling under the jurisdiction of the board were vulnerable to the negative mental health effects of cannabis. As noted by the Government of Canada in the health information that it provides, individuals may experience anxiety or even psychotic symptoms after using cannabis, particularly for inexperienced users or those with pre-existing mental health problems. The information also notes that THC may increase such symptoms. How can C45 manage all of the negative mental health impacts of cannabis on our youth and vulnerable people? It simply cannot. In a short moment, we will be voting on Bill C45. It is important to recognize the full weight and extreme seriousness of the decision we must make about Bill C45, and at the largest extent possible, decide in a way that does the least damage to our youth. We face a momentous decision, and as legislators, not only we are responsible for the acts we enact, but equally so, we have an enormous responsibility to decide ethically, prudently, and wisely. Honourable Senators, let us reflect on the impact our vote will have on Canadians, their physical and mental well-being. I leave you with those thoughts.
Senator Bayak.
Honourable colleagues, I rise today to address Bill C-45, and I want to thank Senator Lankin, for mentioning that she had spoken to her hometown folks earlier. I think nothing is more important to us and our work here in the Senate than talking to the people. In my own region, the Indigenous and non-Indigenous population alike are now visibly nervous as the unintended consequences of this bill become known through all the media reports and the many witnesses who have come and testified to us that they are simply not ready. Most importantly, I think we're missing something in that we have a mandate from this Liberal government. There are 36 million Canadians. 7 million almost voted Liberal, 6 million voted Conservative, 4 million voted others, and 10 million children under 18 had no vote at all. To say that the Liberals have a mandate to do something that's going to fundamentally change the face of Canada is simply not true. Voters voted for decriminalization, no record, no jail time. They voted to protect children. They didn't vote for broken international drug treaties, difficult drug transportation enforcement on our roads and rails and in the sky, a blemish on our stellar international reputation, probable travel restrictions to the USA, our closest neighbor on the longest undefended border in the world, federally enforced laws prohibiting marijuana use there. The number of amendments to clauses with obvious harm to children should give us all pause. Those children have no voice. The amendments have been proposed or adopted and should be carefully considered in the other place. But before that, I would like us to exercise our sober second thought. What is the rush? Canada has survived without legal recreational marijuana and thrived for 150 years. Medicinal marijuana is already available for anyone who needs it. Colleagues, should we consider in all good conscience simply defeating this divisive, complicated, costly, harmful bill and instead ask the other place to decriminalize marijuana immediately, and then craft a bill that is worthy of the concerns that Canadians have brought to us over these last few weeks? I think that would be much more suitable than this, a bill that has zero defects, that strives to do it right the first time for our precious children. Thank you.
Senator Patterson.
Honourable Senators, I rise today to speak to Bill C-45. Since the bill was introduced in our chamber at the end of November, we have had 5 committees study it. We've had over 100 witnesses appear and had months of spirited debate over the bill and potential amendments, and this is a credit to the Senate in contrast to the rush process in the other place. Senator Wu talked about all the experts who gave evidence formally and informally. Too bad their advice was so often ignored. As you know, I personally traveled to every community in Nunavut, sought the advice of as many community members as possible to help inform my final vote. What did I hear from the residents of Nunavut in my exhaustive tour? They said what Aboriginal people and leaders have told us from all across the country. Why the rush? We are not ready. I heard that municipal governments are not ready to deal with employees impaired by marijuana operating heavy equipment in adverse conditions. I heard their astonishment that there's no reliable method of testing for operating a vehicle impaired by marijuana. Every community also highlighted the urgent need for increased education on the effects of marijuana, the need to have that understanding and support in place well before legalization. I heard their concerns that writing local bylaws, developing new human resource policies, training police and bylaw officers would be expensive and time-consuming. I heard their astonishment upon learning that the federal bill would allow persons as young as 18 to possess marijuana. They were amazed there'd be no criminal consequences for young people as young as 12 possessing up to 5 grams of marijuana, and yet at the same time the bill would severely punish persons trafficking to young people. The people of Nunavut were understandably most concerned about protecting youth, a very high demographic in our population. One community I visit now yet had half its population under 14, and I found them to be well aware of the potential dangers of this mind-altering substance on the developing brain. They were well aware of the risk of mental health impacts on people who've been impacted by trauma, a high proportion of Indigenous population in my territory. They talked knowledgeably about what we've also heard from medical experts: schizophrenia, anxiety, depression, as certain impacts that would be specially felt in Nunavut communities with their fragile social fabric. Communities already plagued by family violence, suicide, and mental health impacts. Communities where, sadly, standoffs with young people with mental issues and police are becoming almost routine. They were deeply concerned that there are no culturally based community wellness and mental health programs and no addictions treatment facilities in Nunavut or indeed in any of the 3 northern territories. Some express the view that this is all about money, and we have felt these pressures in this place, where the government leader in the Senate at first tried to negotiate a 3rd reading vote for the end of April. Why would the Trudeau government do this to us without consulting us, they asked. I fervently hope I'm wrong, but I have my doubts about all the promises we've been given, which have been eagerly accepted by supporters of the bill. So let's examine the assurances we've been given. We're assured that this bill will put the dealers out of business. Colleagues, this issue came up in my community consultations. In Clyde River, Nunavut, an isolated place on Baffin Island, members of the Hamlet Council told me that unless the price was significantly lower than $10 per gram, suppliers from the south and dealers in the north will undercut the government price by selling in volume through the mail and even covering postage charges. They also said that unless the government-supplied marijuana has high THC levels, and we're assured by the government this won't happen, the dealers will eagerly sell drugs laden with higher amounts of THC. Others predicted that dealers would sell to young people, or that they would move into new markets for harder drugs. Then we have the bizarre provision in this bill that will allow unlimited quantities of marijuana in a dwelling house. Now, admittedly, this can be modified by a province or territory, but where it's not, this is surely an invitation to trafficking. It's not a far stretch to imagine a knock on a dealer's door who's been stockpiling due to a lack of limits on what's allowed in the home, to be approached by someone saying, "My package didn't come in the mail, the plane didn't come in, the store is closed. Can you sell or give me a supply?" Another thing we're told is this bill will protect youth. Colleagues, I do fervently hope I'm wrong, but I fear, and many residents of Nunavut do fear, that there will be negative impacts from this bill. The current reality is that Nunavut residents, isolated in 25 remote communities, are commonly paying $50 per gram and up to $100. Making this mind-altering drug more easily available and cheaper in our remote communities will be catastrophic, many people predict. I share this fear. There will be casualties. There will be mental illness. There will be brain damage. There will be deaths. Now, I may be accused of being alarmist. Some of you folks who live in the South don't see the standoffs, the suicides, the violence that we must live with in the Arctic. In many communities in Nunavut, where half the kids are already not attending school, how will the easy availability of this mind-numbing drug affect school attendance? And just when we're making progress employing Inuit in our fledgling but growing mining industry, how many more mine workers will fail the drug tests imposed by mining companies? We're told that Indigenous people were consulted. This is clearly skating over the reality. The Aboriginal people, including the Inuit of Nunavut, were given token consultation. First Nations were left out of the revenue streams. They were given no authority to decide for themselves whether they want this mind-altering drug allowed in their communities at all. This gives the lie to the stated intention of our current government to establish a new nation-to-nation relationship, to respect the inherent right to self-government protected in the Constitution, enshrined in the Constitution, to respect the UN Declaration which calls for informed and prior consent, and to establish new fiscal relations. There have been no significant commitments or progress in developing culturally relevant education materials, nor in supporting community-based counseling and wellness programs, which will surely be sorely needed more than ever before. There were no significant commitments to providing addiction treatment services. One organization and Indigenous leader after another has called for a delay so they can be meaningfully engaged. Now, I do respect the fact that my Indigenous Senate colleagues were more or less satisfied with a letter from two ministers promising continued consultation and engagement on the many issues identified in the report of the Standing Committee on Aboriginal Peoples, promising to address and accommodate jurisdictional issues, a new fiscal relationship, and so on going forward. Rest assured, we're told. The phrase is repeated twice in the minister's letter. Pass the bill and these issues will be addressed. Rest assured. No, I will not rest assured. I will wait to see, even though we can't afford to wait in Nunavut. If we get fluff and promises of more dialogue in September, I hope my Indigenous colleagues and fellow committee members will demand action on the promises made yesterday. We have, colleagues, before us a bill that also creates a convoluted checkerboard regime across the country with contradicting laws in neighboring provinces and territories. I believe that we've identified too many flaws and have had proven to us that this bill will not achieve its many stated goals. Colleagues, I participated in the Ledane Commission hearings as a young law student at Dalhousie University in Halifax. I made a presentation, actually, to Ledane. And I remember meeting with one of the commissioners informally at the time who said that marijuana will cause harms to what he called the ship of state. The question is, to what extent are we going to jeopardize productivity, mental health, and weaken the watertight doors on the ship of state by this measure? When I look at the rush to pass this bill late in the government's mandate, the huge holes and inconsistencies in the legislation which I've outlined, not to mention the blatant exclusion of Aboriginal people in the consultation and development of this bill, surely its biggest weaknesses, I have serious concerns that this bill will be beneficial for our country, for Nunavut, and our broader Canadian society. I believe, and I do fervently hope I'm wrong, that we will pay an intolerable price that we will regret. I told the people of Nunavut that unless there were guarantees of systems in place to deal with the predictable harms and negative impacts of easy availability of marijuana in Nunavut, I would vote against the bill. I'm not assured. I will not vote for this bill. Thank you.
Senator Lovelace Nicholas.
Question? Yes, Senator Patterson, I believe that it would be up to each community to opt in or opt out on the government's legalization of cannabis. So wouldn't your community have a bylaw not allowing cannabis?
Senator Patterson.
I thank the senator for the question. The First Nations communities, we know, we were told by a Justice Department expert, cannot opt out of the cannabis legislation because it's not allowed in the Indian Act. The Indian Act only allows for local votes on alcohol prohibition. This is a law of general application that will apply to First Nations communities in Nunavut, in Canada. And in passing this bill, we are going to deprive those First Nations communities of the right to govern themselves, despite our government's declaration of its support for the inherent right to self-government as entrenched in Section 35 of the Constitution. Now, in my communities of Nunavut that are not governed by the Indian Act, I believe it would be possible, it may be possible for the government of Nunavut to allow hamlets to enact local prohibitions. They do so now with alcohol, and they may do so with marijuana. But the government of Nunavut did, in a discussion paper it issued leading up to the discussion of this bill, and before they introduced their own legislation, which, by the way, is only at a very early stage, they did say they felt that power to prohibit cannabis use in communities would be very difficult to enforce. And so the government of Nunavut's stated position is that they won't allow that authority. But I'm more concerned about First Nations communities because they've told us that they govern themselves. They have the responsibility to deal with education and health and social impacts. They're not getting any revenue because they've been left out of the excise tax, and they're not allowed to make a prohibition because of the Indian Act and because this is a law of general application. So your community and First Nations communities are left out of this bill unless it's fixed after the fact. I remain optimistic. Those issues will be addressed, but I'm a skeptic. I'm going to be holding the governments, the ministers, to account for their promises. And I think it's better to correct these things before the bill is passed, not after. That's why I'm voting against it. Thank you.
Senator Dean.
Honour, I am the final speaker this evening, as I understand it. I won't be taking my 45 minutes. I want to start by offering a few thanks. And the first is to my independent senator colleagues, who over the last 7 months joined me in a journey of learning about cannabis and its problems and the challenges across the country. It's been an interesting journey, and as late as yesterday, one or two of my colleagues were still landing on where they wanted to vote, which is evidence of keeping an open mind and not shutting it down too early in the process. And I thank them for that. I thank Senator Eggleton, who was and has been an absolutely superb chair of the Social Affairs Committee. It was given an enormously difficult job to filter the work of the other 4 committees, a hugely complex bill. And Senator Eggleton, thank you on behalf of all of us. You did a fantastic job. I want to thank all of our senators here for participating in the debates, and extensively today, and especially in this format. We know it worked in medical assistance in dying. We've talked about it for a number of months. We've used it again here. And I think every one of us in here again has been reminded of the fact that planned and organised debates with themes helps us to follow and prepare and to know what's coming. But more importantly, it helps those people outside of the Senate who want to participate in our work, who want to see what we're doing, who want to follow along. And many of you will have seen your Twitters light up with those who are responding almost instantaneously to things that are happening in here. And that's fantastic. And with cameras coming in here in the next little while, we're going to have to be at the top of our game. And I hope, and I think we will be doing much more of this. I want to thank the Chamber staff who support us, and I want to thank staff of the Senate who support all of us in this place, but a particular thanks to my staff. I have 2 staff, and all of the stuff that you've received, and all of the briefing materials, and all of the advice that many of you have received has been generated by Amanda McLaren and Lauren Thomas. And they have done an absolutely superb job. I want to thank public servants in the federal government, and particularly those at the Department of Health and Justice, who, to use an English term, have taken a bit of stick over the last few weeks. Inappropriately so, in my view. We are blessed as parliamentarians in this country to be supported by a professional and non-partisan public service that is among the best in the world, if not the best in the world. They support us and they serve us daily. They serve Canadians daily, and they earn our trust every day, and they deserve our respect. And I thank them for the work they've done in supporting me and my colleagues as we've worked hard on this bill. And I'm going to single out Mr. Eric Costin from the Department of Health, the head of the Department of Health's Cannabis Secretariat, who has been on a cannabis journey since the early days of medical cannabis, and who brought all of that expertise into the recreational cannabis discussion. One of the finest public servants that I have worked with. I'm going to thank one more person. This is a person who's travelled with me on this professional journey in terms of sponsorship of Bill C-45, but also on a personal journey that I didn't expect to be taking, that started last November, coincidentally, when the bill came into the chamber, and that's my wife Marie Boutillier up there, who is in the chamber and has supported me wonderfully. One of the questions I'm most often asked as sponsor of Bill C-45 is why on earth did you take that on? The answer is simple. When I saw a complex piece of public policy wrapped up in legislation heading towards this place, I wanted to be part of it. I saw opportunities and not problems. I saw the opportunity to work with that piece of legislation, to improve it, to make it the best that it could be, and to make it work in the most efficient and effective way that it can for Canadians. And I have not been disappointed. This has been a fantastic journey for me, and I've never regretted it for a moment. I want to share my perspectives on that, though. Having been around public policy and public administration and politicians for the last 25 years, I've noticed that every now and again, a government, and it can be a government of any political stripe, decides to embrace and tackle and attempt to resolve a pressing social or health policy challenge. And make no mistake, that's what the government did in choosing to think about legalising and regulating cannabis. Now, they were supported, the government was supported by an expert task force, yes. It was a campaign commitment, yes. But this was not an easy thing to take on for a government. It wasn't done on a whim. You don't do these things without expending a significant amount of political capital. Any complex health and social initiative is complex by its nature. And when things are complex, it's easy to snipe at them. I'll be frank and blunt in saying that. It's easy to pick away at them. It's not simple like prohibition. It's not simple like just say no. It's complex. And over the last several months, we've had the ability, those of us who've wanted to engage in that, to take that legislation apart piece by piece, to understand it, to wrestle with it, to understand the challenges that it is trying to address and the solutions that it is trying to achieve. And look, I mean, we know that that the bill is tackling known harms, and there's no difference between us on the harms. Perhaps the only difference is that we've heard alleged in this place that we'll see many harms resulting from the passage of this bill. There's not one of those harms that is in existence today, pre-cannabis reform. They're all happening right under our noses, and we know that. The health impacts, the social impacts in terms of criminalisation, particularly of our Indigenous and other racialised Canadians in excessive numbers. The massive illegal market is burgeoning right under our noses. Here's what the government did. The government chose to take the lid off that. It chose to surface those problems, to start a national debate across the country about cannabis and what's happening with cannabis in this country right now. I think that was a brave political move on the part of this government, and I think it will be one that is historic and that will help, not hinder, Canadians. In the last several months, we as parliamentarians, and I'll put it this way, we have held a significant responsibility in our hands to look at that legislation, to examine it, and to make the very best of it, and to give of our best advice as seasoned parliamentarians in some cases, seasoned policymakers in others. We know that this is addressing an approach, it's an approach to tackling problems that have been ignored for years. Senator Mercer reminds us of the Nolan report. It's interesting, I haven't heard one of Senator Nolan's colleagues refer to him in the last 7 months. A champion of progressive drug reform. 46 years later and on from the Ledane report. We've been engaged here in bringing existing problems with cannabis out of the dark and into the light. That's what we've been doing. That's what we've been doing here, and I think we've been doing a good job of that. We know that it isn't working right now. We know that prohibition doesn't work. And as we move towards the vote, I'm really clear about the opportunities flowing from C45 for young Canadians, and I support it. Here's what I worry about. Here's what I've been worrying about over the last few weeks. I worry more about the implications and the impact of voting no. That's what would concern me, given all that we've learned. Because as Senator Nolan said himself 16 years ago, legalisation and regulation is better for young Canadians, is safer for young Canadians than is prohibition. And I don't think Senator Nolan's conclusion has changed one bit. If anything, the problems that he was talking about have only worsened, while we have pretended that prohibition is working. Now I'm going to finish. I don't have much more to say. As we consider voting on this bill, what do we know about voting no? We know that a vote against legalisation and the regulation of cannabis in this country is a vote for continued prohibition, for the continued criminalisation of young people and older people, and particularly those who can least afford it, those who are the most marginalised and disadvantaged in this country. We're saying, you take care of yourselves. We like prohibition better. We feel more comfortable with prohibition. You take care of yourselves. And we're saying, the health harms, well, we'll kind of just shut the door and look the other way again. While people continue to be harmed, young people continue to be harmed by cannabis. And we're saying, having weighed it up, I think we like prohibition more than a burgeoning, growing $6 billion illegal cannabis market in this country, in which the product of that illegal market is not tested for potency, is not tested for contaminants. They carry no warning labels. They carry no potency labels. They don't come in child-proof bags. And we know that those products are available widely across the country now, and that there'll still be a wider range of those products available than would be available in the narrow, limited offerings in a cautionary approach to cannabis legalisation that is being proposed by the government. I'll just say this again. I would rather not go back there. I would rather not allow those harms to continue, both on the social side and the health side. And I would like to join other jurisdictions, like those in the US, that have seen a significant diversion. Colorado, 50% diversion from its illegal market to the legal market. It does work. So I'm saying I'm voting yes for Bill C-45. And I'm asking those who would still consider voting no to think very, very hard about the implications and consequences of doing that. Thank you so much.
Are senators ready for the question? It was moved by the Honourable Senator Dean, seconded by the Honourable Senatrice Dupuy, that the bill as amended be read a third time. Is it your pleasure, Honourable Senators, to adopt the motion? Yay! All those in favour of the motion will please say yea. Yay! All those opposed, nay. Nay! In my opinion, the yeas have it. I see two senators rising. Pursuant to paragraph 2.4 of the order adopted on May 31st, we have a 15-minute bell. The vote will take place at 9:01. Call in the senators.